I don't know who needs to hear this, but if you're in America, you probably really need to hear this. What you may not realize is that you are in the middle of a stress test. And for those of you who don't know, a stress test is when you take a system or a piece of machinery or what have you and you push it to its limits to see how far you can push it until it breaks. You run a car engine until it falls apart. You initiate a jet engine until it overheats. You flood an email server until it crashes. You stress it to its limits until it falls apart to see how bad it can get before it stops working, and then you decide whether or not that's good enough. You find out that you can push a car to 200 miles per hour for 15 hours straight before the engine seizes, and you figure, well, that's fine. No one's going to drive this car 200 miles an hour for 15 hours straight, so it passes the stress test. Well, if you're in America, you are in the middle of that stress test, and it has failed for the past several decades. Uh, we have been pushing the limits of how much you can push down the middle class while extracting capital from the country and inflating the hyper wealthy to see how far it can go before the bottom drops out. And here we are. It's because of lack of education. It's because of poor, poor. Mm, it's because minimum wage is so low. It is because our health costs are so high. All these things and a dozen others have all pushed together to show us that when things get bad, they get worse. It starts a domino effect of just things getting worse and worse, and all the mechanisms that we've used and gotten used to in order to address these issues and kick these problems down the road are finally coming due. You cannot keep extracting wealth from the economy such that people cannot go more than 2 weeks or 3 weeks without working and then see what happens, when so many people go out of work and now they hit the streets because we didn't have it because we weren't allowed to make enough money to put aside to deal with these things, to deal with the the terrible costs for our health care if somebody gets sick for 2 weeks. If your average family is crippled by one or two people being unable to work for 2 weeks, if whole swaths of your industry and economy start to fall apart, if people are evicted from their homes because they do not have 2 months of rent saved up, not because of lack of work, but because of lack of wealth, then you have failed the stress test. You have failed the social economic stress test for your country, for this country. And, well, then you have to do the intelligent thing, which is go, how did we get here? And how do we get away from here? Now that we know we failed the stress test, now that we know one bad month, 2 bad months, one predicted catastrophe. 10 years ago, they were telling us there's going to be a pandemic. We are going to get hit by some horrible disease that's going to run through our systems, run through our nation. We'll have to deal with that because this was never an if. It was always a when. It's like a car accident. You can do everything in your power to avoid it, but eventually things are going to happen. Maybe not you specifically, but there's going to be car accidents. There are going to be fires. There are going to be blackouts. There are going to be hurricanes. So, once it happens, you go, what can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? What can we do to make sure that when it happens again, it doesn't hit us as hard? How do we pass the stress test? And if part of your solution isn't, well, let's reconfigure the economy so that if we suddenly lose a large portion of it for a couple weeks, it doesn't self-destruct, then you haven't learned anything. What's going to happen in 5, 10 years if we get hit again with something like this and we haven't raised the minimum wage, if we haven't rebuilt our infrastructure, if we haven't reduced the cost of health insurance and improved the quality of living, if we haven't migrated enough of our economy to working from home, if we don't have the mechanisms in place to aid the homeless, to deal with those who have been harmed by drug use and drug abuse, whether they're using it or they're related to somebody who is using it or what have you, it doesn't matter. All these problems will come up again, and the next time they come up, it's going to be worse if you don't fix the problem, if you don't adjust for the stress test. So what are we doing? Millions of people are in line to lose their homes and to be evicted onto the street. You thought the rioting and the breaking and the looting and the stress was bad before? Keep pushing people who have no wealth, who have no means, who have nothing to look forward to onto the street, and see how fast it turns to burning things down. Because if your society, if your country isn't working for the majority of your people, then all the majority of your people need to learn, need to see in order to turn into majority revolutionaries is time. That's why they distract you so much with nonsense. That's why they try to work you to death, because they know if you had to stop and think about it for a while, if enough of us got together and thought about it for a while, we just go, let's just burn this shit down and start over, because obviously this isn't working. And here we are, at the tail end of the stress test. We're at the point where they're starting to do things to try and deal with it. And we get to decide, do we let them put it back together the same way it was on January 1st? Recreate the same system that so thoroughly failed us? Or do we go, no, the engine broke down, the servers didn't hold, the stress test failed, make something better? That's your choice. Our choice. So what are we going to do? Return to normal? The normal that left us high and dry as soon as it got a little hard on the economy, a little hard on the government? Or do we build a new normal? Do we learn from this stress test and decide, no, make something better? Something to chew on.